Welcome to lesson 2.4, multiplying and dividing integers. Today we're going to talk about negatives and times a negative and why it gives you a positive, and negative times positive and why it gives you a negative. I want you to be able to multiply with integers, and I want you to understand that dividing integers is the inverse of multiplying integers. And I want you to be able to divide with integers. And I also want you to be able to solve problems involving multiplying and dividing with integers. All right, so first let's look at this scenario. So look at these situations. If you have a good guy, that's a positive, and a bad guy would be a negative. And coming to town is good for the town, and leaving town is bad for the town. So if you have a good guy who comes to town, that would be a good thing. That would be a positive. Oops. Okay, so then if you have, so a good guy coming to town would be a positive. So a positive and a positive is a positive. A bad guy coming to town would be a bad thing. It would be a negative. So we're looking at kind of multiplying and dividing integers situationally. So when you look at situations, two good things would be a good thing. A bad guy coming to town, so even though coming to town is good, the fact that it's a bad guy coming to town makes it a bad thing. Then a good guy leaving town is bad for the town, so it's a bad outcome or a negative outcome. And then a bad guy leaving town would actually be a positive outcome. So situationally, this is why when you're looking at why two negatives makes a positive, this would be a good example of that situation. All right, so a helpful reminder. Remember that multiplication is repeated addition. So if I have 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2, we turn that into 5 times 2, and that gives us 10. So on that same token, if I have negative 2 and I add that together 5 times, it's the same thing as saying 5 times a negative 2. And when I add negative 2, so I know that a negative plus a negative is always a negative. So when I take that positive 5 and multiply it by a negative 2, that's why I get a negative 10. So again, when you look at the math behind it, this makes sense. So these are typically easy for us to understand why that works out. Okay, so let's take a look at how multiplying integers works. So if I have 4 times a negative 2, I'm looking at it and saying, okay, I have to go to negative 2 4 different times. So I start at 0 and it's 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so I'm jumping backwards negative 2 4 different times. If I have a negative 4 plus 2, or I'm sorry, times a positive 2, so now I'm jumping back negative 4 spaces 2 times, which also gets me to negative 8. Okay, so even though this is positive, this is just telling me how many times to do it, and the negative is telling me which direction to go. So number line wise, if we're jumping negative 4 groups 2 times or negative 2 groups 4 times, it works out. And that's why we're getting to a negative number. Or we can look at it in terms of a coordinate plane. So you know that everything in quadrant 1 is a positive. But if you look at it, so let's look at what this would represent. Let's look at this number line as the value of the cards, and let's look at the positive and negatives here as drawing and discarding. So in quadrant 1, you have your drawing positive cards. So when you draw positive cards, it's the same thing as saying you're adding, and I'll write adding, positive cards, which we know should increase our value. Okay, so if I draw a positive 1, I know I will have 1 point. And then if I draw 2 positive ones, that's 2 points. Okay, and so on and so forth. So if I draw 1 positive 2, it'll raise my total 2 points. If I draw 2 positive 2s, it'll raise it 4 points. If I draw 4 positive 2s, it'll bring my score up 8 points. That's why all of these are positive. Now I'm not going to go through and fill all of these out, but I'd like you to. It's honestly just like you're multiplying. So if I draw 1 card and it's a positive 3, my points go up 3. If I draw 2 cards and they're both positive 3s, my point goes up by 6. Here though, so now I have negatives, because we understand how the number line works and that once we go to the left that we have negative cards. Now in this case, instead of drawing, this would mean that we are discarding. And in this quadrant, so in quadrant 2, we are discarding positive cards. And when we discard positives, that is like subtracting positives, which we know decreases the value. So if I discard a positive 1, so discard a positive 1, my score goes down 1 point. If I discard 1 positive 2, my score goes down 2 points. If I discard 1 positive 3, my score goes down 3 points. So let's look at this. If I discard 5 times, and each time I discard a positive 5, that means I'm losing 25 points. If I discard 4 times, and I discard 2 both times, I'm losing 8 points. All right, so now again, I would like you to fill out those, and I really want you to make sure that you're understanding here why this is working. So when you look at your values, we said getting rid of positive cards brings your value down, and drawing positive cards brings your value up. So that's why when you multiply, so 2 times a positive 3, they're both positive, so drawing and a positive are both positive situations. So that's going to raise your score, which means you're going to get a positive answer. Discarding is considered a negative, and when you're discarding positive integers, that's going to decrease your score, and decreasing gives you the negative. So here we have discarding negative cards. So if I discard negatives, I know that that's the same thing as subtracting a negative. And we've talked about how subtracting a negative actually increases your value. Okay, so if I discard twice and both times I discard a negative 2, my score is going to go up 4 points because I'm getting rid of 2 negative 2s, which means I'm getting rid of 2 negative 2s that can bring my score down. Okay, if I discard, which is a negative, and I discard 3 times, and each time I discard a negative 3, that means my score is going to go up 9 points. Okay, so again, discarding negatives is a positive situation, so that's why discarding negatives or subtracting negatives is going to be a positive outcome. So in this case, when you're doing this, instead of saying negative 2 minus negative 2 minus negative 2, we turn it into a multiplication problem. All right, so now we're working with a situation where we have a draw, so it's positive, so we're drawing, but now we're drawing negative cards. So when you draw negative cards, we know that that is like adding a negative. And when you add a negative, we know that that decreases your value. Okay, so if I draw 2 negative 2's, that is going to bring my score down by 4 points. If I draw 3 negative 2's, that is going to bring my score down 6 points. If I draw 5 negative 3's, so 5 times a negative 3, that is going to bring my score down 15 points. Okay, again, I want you to finish filling all these out, and I am using this to help you understand why multiplying by positives and negatives gives you the outcome that it does. So that is the focus here, is why does this positive times this negative, why does it give me a negative answer? And putting it in terms of drawing and discarding cards is another way that we can use to explain it. All right. So when we look at how integer multiplication works, what we can do is we can just ignore the signs and multiply. So we know that we know 4 times 2 is 8. And I know that since it's a negative 4 and a positive 2, I know it's going to be a negative answer. Okay, so here a negative 4 and a negative 2. So again, this is like discarding 4 times and discarding a negative 2 each of those times. So I know that I'm discarding a negative, which I know gives me a positive outcome. So it's going to raise my value. Since it's raising my value, I know my answer is just going to be a positive 8 because the negative and the negative gives me a positive. All right, so when you look at division, so think of negative 8 split into 4 parts. So each part would have negative 2 pieces. So you have negative 1 and negative 1, negative 1 and negative 1, negative 1 and negative 1, negative 1 and negative 1. So here's negative 8 total, and then when you put it into 4 groups, you end up with negative 2 in each group. Since we know division is the inverse of multiplication, this would make sense. Okay, so when you are doing this backwards, it would be the same thing as multiplication. So I know that if my multiplication rule is that a positive times a negative gives me a negative, then it would have to be the same. So a positive 4 times a negative 2 giving me a negative 8. If I took that negative 8 and divided it by that positive 4, I would still have to get that negative 2. Okay, so with our rules, we know a positive times or divided by a positive is a positive. A negative times or divided by a negative is always going to give me a positive. And a positive times or divided by a negative is always going to give me a negative. So this is different than your adding and subtracting, where when your signs are different, it automatically gives you a negative. So this is typically the one that gets mistaken the most. Okay, so let's try a couple of these together, and then you can go on and you can try them on your own. So here, like I said, you ignore the signs and you multiply. So 7 times 8 I know is 56. Since my signs are different, I know that it is a negative 56. Here, it's 6 times 5 is 30. Since my signs are different, I know it's a negative 30. Here I have 7 times 3 is 21. Since 3 is negative and 7 is positive, it's a negative 21. Here I have negative 4 times negative 9. I know 4 times 9 is 36. And since it's 2 negatives, I know it gives me a positive. Here I have 12 times 7. I know that that gives me 84. And I know that since it's a negative and a negative, I get a positive. Okay, so again, the multiplication is the same. It's just the signs that tell you if it's negative or positive. So what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to try these 10 problems on your own. As always, if you have any questions, make sure to email me or write them down so we can go over them in class.